Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty huge. The gaps, the systemic gaps in how the world counters terrorism financing, CFT, and specifically how these failures are, well, feeding this crisis across Africa.
Yeah, the main point from our sources is stark, really unavoidable now.
Oh.
Africa has clearly become the new global epicenter for terrorist activity.
Mm.
And if you're in global finance, you need to understand this isn't just some distant security issue anymore. It's a direct, heightened financial risk.
Absolutely. And our goal here is to connect the dots. We're taking the UN's global assessment of CFT weaknesses and blending it with more specific intelligence from the African Union and FATF, that's the Financial Action Task Force. We need to see how this convergence creates this, well, profoundly heightened risk profile for the whole financial system.
Okay, let's dig into the data that really shows this shift. The numbers are frankly staggering. We really are.
You're looking at something like a 400% jump in terrorist attacks and a 237% rise in deaths from terrorism in Africa just between 2012 and 2020. And that trend, it's just kept going. Over 3,200 attacks, 8,400 casualties in the first 9 months of 2024 alone.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really concerning now is how it's spreading geographically. We're seeing groups that used to be mainly in the Sahel pushing into coastal states, Benin, Togo, Ghana, places that seemed relatively untouched before.
And this escalation, it's happening partly because the global system itself has some, let's say, foundational weaknesses. The UN pointed out that many national risk assessments, the tools countries use to map their financial vulnerabilities, they consistently fail. They fail to properly analyze risks in the informal economy, areas with heavy cash use. And they're also missing newer methods, things like virtual assets, crowdfunding. These just aren't being assessed correctly in many places. And then there are the legal frameworks. Often they're just not up to scratch. They might not criminalize financing for any purpose, which is crucial, or funding travel for foreign fighters. But look, the biggest operational gap, it's the failure to actually use financial intelligence effectively.
Right.
FATF found, get this, 69% of jurisdictions they assessed have major problems investigating and actually prosecuting terrorism financing. 69%. That's a huge enforcement gap.
Wow. Okay, so if the basic regulatory structure has these holes, how are the terror groups adapting? This is where it gets critical for compliance teams listening, right?
Exactly. And we're seeing two really important shifts in how they operate. First, what we can call the symbiotic nexus. You've got major groups deeply intertwined with transnational organized crime. They're profiting together from illicit trade, resource exploitation thinking, illegal mining, and even levying their own taxes in areas where the state basically has no control. It's less about shared command, more about mutually beneficial financial integration in ungoverned spaces.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second shift?
The second one is maybe the real aha moment, especially for compliance. It's the move towards microfinancing. The FATF notes that often it's lone individuals, sometimes younger people, using these fragmented funding strategies. We're talking small amounts from petty crime, sure, but also increasingly from technology. Things like, believe it or not, gaming and social media payments.
Hold on. So you're telling me a, say, $15 payment on some gaming platform could potentially be terrorist financing that needs flagging, like a big wire transfer?
That's precisely the challenge. It completely changes the game for compliance. Your traditional monitoring, looking for large, suspicious transactions, it's just not enough anymore. The whole strategy has got to shift towards analyzing behavior across lots of low-value, scattered payments.
Which sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. And it means financial institutions. You simply cannot rely solely on the host country's own regulatory framework to protect you, especially if that country is already on FATF's gray list. Under increased monitoring, the systemic weaknesses are often just too deep. So the big takeaway for chief compliance officers, for anyone in risk management, is that you need a fundamental shift. You've got to move towards an intelligence-led, risk-based framework.
Meaning
You proactively use international intelligence reports for the UN, the AU's Counterterrorism Center, to shape your internal risk models. And you update your enhanced due diligence, your EDD, to really scrutinize non-financial sectors known to be vulnerable in these regions, like construction, commodities trading.
Right. So this really requires a much more joined-up approach then.
Exactly. It demands collaboration. The African Union is pushing for a whole-of-society response. They're highlighting the need for real, secure, two-way intelligence sharing between the public sector, which has the threat context, and the private sector, which holds so much of the transactional data. You have to close those resource and knowledge gaps. They have to talk constantly.
Okay, that makes sense. A tough challenge.
It is. And maybe here's a final thought for you, for everyone listening. If we're saying that global financial institutions now need to pivot from a comfortable rules-based compliance model to a much more demanding intelligence-led strategy just to manage risks linked to Africa, well, what does that imply about how much we rely on those traditional regulatory frameworks elsewhere in the world, even in places that seem stable? Something to think about.